The order was never meant to be refused.
Not because it was irresistible, not because the clones moved too fast, but because by the time Palpatine transmitted those 3 words, every choice that could have stopped them had already been made years earlier in rooms Anakin was never allowed to enter, by people who had already decided what he was for. Refusal was always possible. That's the part that should disturb you. The history of Order 66 is told simply because simple is easier to survive. A Sith Lord hidden in plain sight activated a biological kill switch embedded in an army of clones. Jedi across the galaxy were gunned down by soldiers they had fought beside for 3 years. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, the most powerful Force-sensitive in a generation, did not resist. He led the slaughter at the Jedi Temple himself. He became Darth Vader. The Republic died. The Empire rose. And the darkness that followed lasted for 2 decades before a single act of redemption, from a man who was barely recognizable as the person he had once been, finally ended it. That's the story most people accept. It's clean. It's linear. It follows the logic of tragedy: a good man falls, and the galaxy pays the price. But here is the question that the official story quietly buries. What would have happened if he hadn't? Not in the abstract, philosophical sense. Not, would the galaxy have been a better place? Because that question assumes the answer is obvious, and the answer is not obvious at all. But in the specific, mechanical, brutal sense, what would the galaxy have looked like in the hours, days, and years immediately following a moment in which Anakin Skywalker heard the transmission, felt something break in his understanding of the world, and said no? The answer is not heroic. It is not clean, and it is far darker than most people want to admit. Let's begin with what refusal would have actually required. The assumption embedded in every "what if Anakin said no" conversation is that refusal was a single decision, a moral threshold he either crossed or didn't. The popular imagination pictures him standing in the Jedi Temple with lightsaber drawn, clones at his back, receiving the signal from Coruscant and simply choosing not to act. One moment, one choice. The darkness averted. That framing is wrong, and understanding why it's wrong is the first crack in the story.
Anakin's participation in Order 66 was not a single decision.
It was the final link in a chain of decisions that stretched back years, each one individually survivable, each one subtly narrowing the corridor of choices available to him. By the time the order was transmitted, Anakin Skywalker had already told Palpatine about Mace Windu's location. He had already intervened to stop Windu from killing the Chancellor. He had already pledged himself to the dark side in exchange for knowledge he believed would save Padmé's life. He had already chosen, which means refusal, real refusal, not cinematic refusal, would have had to occur earlier. And the moment you start moving the refusal backward in time, the implications become increasingly difficult to contain. If he refuses at the moment of Order 66, if he simply does not lead the 501st to the temple, what has he actually accomplished? The clones still receive their biochip programming, the Jedi across the galaxy still die, Palpatine still has his pretext, the Empire still rises. Anakin has preserved his own soul in that moment, but the machinery of galactic transformation grinds forward almost entirely unchanged. The Separatist leadership still gets executed on Mustafar by someone, or doesn't, and the chaos of a headless Separatist movement tears the Outer Rim apart. The clones, operating without the Jedi commanders who would normally have checked their behavior, become something uglier and more autonomous than they were ever designed to be. And this is where it becomes genuinely disturbing. The Jedi Order, or what remains of it, emerges from the survival of a dozen scattered masters and knights, none of whom are communicating with each other, all of whom are in hiding or in combat, none of whom have a command structure, a council, a temple, or a shared strategic vision. And at the center of this fragmentary survival is Anakin Skywalker, who has just refused an imperial order from the Chancellor of the Republic, which means he is now a wanted man operating in a republic that is actively transforming into an empire around him, with a pregnant wife who was a prominent senator, surrounded by an intelligence apparatus that Palpatine has been building for over a decade. The refusal doesn't save the galaxy. It makes the galaxy's situation dramatically more complicated and more dangerous almost immediately. Let's slow down on one specific detail, because it matters more than it first appears.
Palpatine's plan was not primarily dependent on Anakin.
That is a truth that the mythology of Anakin Skywalker tends to obscure. Order 66 was a biochip program embedded in an army of 200,000 clone troopers. The Jedi deaths across the galaxy were going to happen regardless of what Anakin did in the temple. His role in the temple assault was strategically important. The 501st was an elite unit, and the temple was a symbol, but it was not the mechanism by which the Jedi were destroyed. The mechanism was already in motion the moment Palpatine's voice reached every clone in the Grand Army. Which means that if Anakin refuses and does not act, Palpatine loses the symbolic victory of the temple, but he still wins the war in every other theater simultaneously. And now, Palpatine has a problem he did not anticipate, but a problem he had spent years preparing for. He had prepared for the possibility that Anakin might not fully surrender. He had prepared for the possibility that a Jedi, or several Jedi, might survive. He had prepared for the possibility of resistance. The entire architecture of his deception, the manufactured war, the clone army, the Senate's gradual erosion of institutional oversight was designed to leave no viable opposition structure capable of challenging him at the moment of transformation. If Anakin refuses, Palpatine still has Vader. Not Anakin as Vader, but the concept an enforcer, a dark side warrior of supreme capability, trained and cultivated and ready. He could move to that option. He had been moving to that option for years, through Dooku, through Maul, through every dark side apprentice and potential replacement he had been quietly developing in the shadows of the Republic. Anakin was the preferred weapon. He was not the only weapon. The crack in the narrative runs deeper than whether Anakin had the will to refuse. The crack is this: Palpatine had engineered a situation in which Anakin's refusal would itself become a mechanism for the Empire's consolidation. A Jedi who refused Order 66, especially the most famous, most powerful, most politically connected Jedi in the Order, would immediately become the face of Jedi treachery in Palpatine's propaganda. The speech to the Senate, which historically blamed the Jedi for the assassination attempt on the Chancellor, would have been far more effective with a specific, named, surviving Jedi who could be pointed to as the ringleader. Anakin's refusal would have handed Palpatine something more valuable than his compliance. It would have handed him a narrative.
And that narrative would have justified everything.
The occupation of the temple, the posthumous defamation of every Jedi who died in the Purge, the emergency powers, the dissolution of the Senate, all of it would have been anchored to the image of Anakin Skywalker, Jedi Knight, publicly refusing the legal order of the Supreme Chancellor, while in possession of classified military authority over the finest troops in the Republic. From a certain angle, it's hard not to notice the alignment, the way Palpatine's plan was almost designed to convert refusal into ammunition. Almost as if he had anticipated it as one of the possible outcomes and had left a corridor open for it. Let's talk about what Anakin would have needed to survive. The first 24 hours after a refused Order 66 would have been the most dangerous period in the entire alternate timeline. Not because of the clones. Anakin could handle the clones probably for longer than any other Jedi alive. But because of information. Anakin would not have known, in that first hour, how many Jedi were alive. He would not have known whether Obi-Wan had survived, whether Yoda had survived, whether there was any command structure left to coordinate with. He would have known that Padme was alive and that she was on Coruscant, which meant she was in the most dangerous place in the Republic, the capital of a government that was in the process of becoming something else entirely, run by a man who had just been unmasked to Anakin as a Sith Lord and who had every reason to use Padme as leverage. This is the pressure point that every idealized version of this scenario quietly avoids. Anakin's refusal of Order 66 would have immediately put Padme Amidala in lethal danger. Not because Palpatine would have been petty enough to target her immediately, but because Anakin would have known that Palpatine knew she was the vulnerability. He had used that vulnerability to turn Anakin in the first place. The implied threat of her death was the entire engine of Anakin's fall. In an alternate timeline where Anakin refuses, that implied threat becomes explicit almost immediately, because Palpatine would have needed to demonstrate that defiance had consequences. So Anakin refuses. And within hours, he is facing the following situation.
He is the most recognizable face in the Republic military.
There is no hiding. There is no going underground quietly, the way Obi-Wan eventually did on Tatooine. Anakin Skywalker disappearing from Coruscant would have been a galactic news event within days, and Palpatine would have ensured the news framing was exactly as damaging as possible. He cannot go to the Jedi Temple. If it wasn't already occupied by Imperial forces, it would have been within hours. The Temple comm system, which was how the Order communicated across the galaxy, had been broadcasting a recall signal, and in the actual timeline, Anakin was involved in resetting that signal to lure surviving Jedi back to their deaths. In the alternate timeline, that manipulation either doesn't happen, or it happens through a different mechanism, which means some Jedi receive accurate information and begin returning to Coruscant, which means they return to a planet that is in the middle of becoming an authoritarian state, controlled by a Sith Lord, with no plan and no coordination. And this is where the hidden motive becomes impossible to ignore. Palpatine did not want Anakin's compliance simply to destroy the Jedi. He wanted it because Anakin was the only living being in the galaxy who was both powerful enough to matter strategically and sufficiently emotionally compromised to be directed. The entire project of turning Anakin, the years of cultivation, the careful manipulation of his fear and love and anger, was not about Order 66. Order 66 was almost incidental. The biochips handled the Jedi. What Palpatine actually wanted from Anakin was something more difficult to manufacture: legitimacy. An empire that rises on the shoulders of clone soldiers and bureaucratic maneuvering is one kind of empire. An empire that rises with the Chosen One, the prophesied Jedi, the living symbol of what the Order had always claimed to be fighting for at its right hand, is something categorically different. It sends a message that cannot be sent any other way, that even the Force itself, or the greatest being the Force had ever produced, had found the Jedi insufficient, had found the Republic insufficient, had looked at the galaxy and concluded that what it needed was not democracy and light, but order and power. Anakin's fall was not propaganda. It was the propaganda. It was Palpatine's masterpiece.
And so a refused Order 66 doesn't merely present Palpatine with a tactical problem.
It presents him with a philosophical wound he can't simply cauterize. Because now the Chosen One is on the other side, and everything the Empire needs to claim about its own legitimacy has to be rebuilt from different materials. Here is the implication that most people don't follow to its conclusion. An empire built without Vader as its symbolic enforcer would have been compelled to manufacture something else to fill that role. Palpatine would not have remained without a weapon. He would have accelerated his development of whatever alternative he had been quietly cultivating, and the history of his decades-long manipulation of the dark side of the Force suggests that he had alternatives. Maul, who was still alive and active in the underworld; Dooku, who was dead but whose methods and philosophy had shaped a generation of dark side thinking; The Inquisitorius, which came into existence to hunt surviving Jedi, a program that would still have been necessary and possibly more extensively developed, in a timeline where the Temple Purge had been incomplete. The most likely explanation is that the Empire, absent Vader, would have been more brutal in its early years, not less. Because Vader was, paradoxically, a limiting force in his own right. His emotional volatility, his continued internal conflict even in darkness, his specific and targeted approach to the Force, these made him fearsome but also, in a strange sense, principled. He had lines he didn't cross, not because of mercy, but because of the particular shape of his damage. An Imperial enforcer constructed without Anakin Skywalker's emotional architecture would not have had those lines. It would have been something colder and more efficient, and it would have operated without the suppressed grief that gave Vader his strange, awful gravity. The hidden motive, then, runs in both directions simultaneously. Palpatine wanted Anakin, and the galaxy, in some dark and uncomfortable way, was potentially safer with Vader than without him. That doesn't justify what happened, but it explains why the alignment is unsettling.
Let's trace what survival looks like. Not for Anakin, but for the people around him.
In the immediate aftermath of a refused Order 66, Obi-Wan Kenobi's situation changes significantly. In the actual timeline, Obi-Wan survived because Bail Organa extracted him from Utapau after the clone ambush failed to kill him, and because he was operating in relative isolation. In the alternate timeline, the clone ambush on Utapau still happens. Order 66 was transmitted galaxy-wide. Cody still receives the signal. Obi-Wan still falls. But in the alternate timeline, Obi-Wan survives and returns to Coruscant to find something he did not find in the actual history. Anakin Skywalker, still alive, still on the side of the Jedi, or trying to be, and in possession of information about Palpatine's true identity that he has not yet shared with anyone except through action. The reunion of Obi-Wan and Anakin in this timeline is not the confrontation at Mustafar. It is something more complicated and, in many ways, more devastating. Because Obi-Wan Kenobi would have arrived knowing that something had happened to Anakin, that he had stood at the edge and, this time, stepped back. But he would also have arrived knowing what Anakin had done in the days immediately before. The pledge to Palpatine, the intervention that killed Mace Windu, the choice that had set the purge in motion even if Anakin hadn't pulled the trigger at the temple himself. Obi-Wan would have had to reckon with the fact that the man who refused Order 66 was also the man who had handed Palpatine the preconditions for it. That reckoning would have been one of the most painful relationships in the galaxy's history. Two men who loved each other and who had both, in different ways, failed the moment that mattered most. And it would have had to be navigated in real time, in hiding, with an empire assembling around them. Yoda's situation, too, changes in ways that carry forward. In the actual timeline, Yoda goes to Dagobah to wait. His confrontation with Palpatine in the Senate chamber fails, and he withdraws not from cowardice, but from a profound recognition that the time for direct confrontation has passed and that something else is required. In the alternate timeline, Yoda's confrontation with Palpatine still likely ends without a clear victory. Palpatine at full strength, in an environment he controlled, with the political machinery of the new empire operationalizing around him in real time, was not an opponent that even Yoda could simply defeat in open combat. The dark side's influence had been growing for decades. Its roots were too deep.
But in the alternate timeline, Yoda does not go to Dagobah alone.
He goes to Dagobah, if he goes at all, knowing that Anakin is still in the fight. And that knowledge changes the calculus of isolation entirely. The question that emerges from this is one that neither Yoda nor Obi-Wan had to ask in the actual timeline. Do you keep Anakin Skywalker as an asset, or do you protect him as a person? Because in the alternate timeline, Anakin is both. He is the most powerful Force-sensitive alive, and he is also deeply psychologically compromised, still in love with Padme, still carrying the weight of the things he had done before, the refusal, still haunted by the vision that had driven him to the edge in the first place. The Jedi Masters would have recognized, with varying degrees of discomfort, that the person who had just saved himself was not the same person who had originally walked into that choice. He was damaged in specific ways that made him powerful and unstable simultaneously. And Padme, let's not move past Padme quickly, because her situation in the alternate timeline is the consequence that most completely unravels the heroic reading of Anakin's refusal. In the actual timeline, Padme Amidala died shortly after childbirth, of causes that the medical droids described as simply losing the will to live. What that means, mechanically, has been debated. What it meant in the context of the actual story is clear enough. She died of grief, her hope extinguished, her husband transformed into something she could not recognize or reach. In the alternate timeline, Padme does not die of lost hope. She survives. She gives birth to twins. And she is the wife of a man who the new empire has officially designated as a fugitive, a traitor, and the symbol of Jedi corruption. That designation follows her everywhere. Every political alliance she had built, every relationship she had cultivated across decades of service to the Republic, every moral authority she had accrued, all of it is now weaponized against her by an imperial propaganda apparatus that had specifically identified her husband as the enemy. She cannot speak in the Senate without the shadow of Anakin Skywalker falling across every word. She cannot advocate for the systems she had always fought for without being asked whether she knew, whether she had helped, whether she was part of it. She becomes the most politically isolated senator in the Republic's dying days, simultaneously more motivated than she had ever been and less capable of acting on that motivation than at any previous point in her career. And the twins, Luke and Leia, in the alternate timeline, are not hidden. They cannot be hidden in the same way. The separation plan, Obi-Wan taking Luke to Owen Lars, Leia going to Bail Organa, was predicated on no one knowing they existed, and no one having reason to look. In the alternate timeline, Palpatine knows Padme is pregnant. He had implied knowledge, through Anakin, of the pregnancy's significance. A living Anakin Skywalker who has refused the Empire would become the most hunted person in the galaxy, and hunting him would eventually mean hunting everyone connected to him, and hunting everyone connected to him would eventually mean hunting Padme, and hunting Padme would eventually mean discovering the children. The implication here is difficult to sit with. The twins' survival in the actual timeline was made possible by the assumption that no one was actively looking for them. Their survival in the alternate timeline would have required something far more elaborate, far more dangerous, and far less certain, because the one thing an intact Anakin Skywalker guarantees is that Palpatine never stops looking. He cannot afford to. A free Anakin Skywalker is an existential threat to the Empire's philosophical foundation, and Palpatine had not survived 5 decades of Sith scheming by leaving existential threats unaddressed. What happens next reframes everything, because in the alternate timeline, the rebellion does not grow slowly from seeds planted in Bail Organa's quiet networks and Mon Mothma's careful maneuvering, and a generation of ordinary people finally pushed past endurance. It grows fast, and it grows hot, because it has a face, a famous face, a face that the Empire is actively demonizing, which means that every anti-imperial sentiment in the galaxy has a specific, named, living symbol to organize around. Anakin Skywalker as a living dissident is a more powerful symbol than almost any other the rebellion could have manufactured. He is recognizable, he is proven. He is the only person in the galaxy about whom the Empire's propaganda and the rebellion's counter-narrative are in direct, specific, public conflict. You cannot dismiss him as a rumor. You cannot make him disappear quietly. He exists. He chose. And his choice means something to people who are desperately looking for evidence that choice still means something. But a fast rebellion is also a bloody rebellion. The actual rebellion, for all its costs, developed over years in a way that allowed it to build infrastructure before it had to use it. The alternate rebellion develops under pressure in a compressed time frame, with the Empire actively hunting its most visible member and using every atrocity committed in that hunt as a demonstration to the rest of the galaxy of the cost of defiance. Planets that harbor Anakin Skywalker or that are suspected of harboring him do not receive the quiet occupation of the actual Empire. They receive something more urgent and more brutal, because the Empire's credibility requires demonstrating that the rebellion's symbol cannot be protected by ordinary people. The message it needs to send is specific. Even love is not enough to shield you from what we will do. Which means the alternate timeline's galaxy absorbs suffering more quickly, in more concentrated bursts, with less time to mourn between them.
And Anakin lives with that.
He is not Vader, carrying his grief in armor and silence. He is Anakin Skywalker, fully present in his own body and his own conscience, watching what his refusal has cost people who never asked to be part of his story. He is the person the galaxy organizes around, and the person whose existence justifies every atrocity committed in the name of capturing him. That is a weight that the mythological version of this scenario never accounts for. The Anakin who refuses Order 66 does not walk away clean. He walks away carrying a different kind of darkness, the darkness of consequence, the darkness of knowing that his survival is costing people their lives, the darkness of a man who chose the light and discovered that the light, in certain conditions, burns. The most likely explanation, if you follow the thread far enough, is that Anakin Skywalker, in this timeline, becomes something the Jedi Order had never produced and had never intended to produce. A warrior of the light side operating outside every institution that had ever tried to contain or direct or protect the light side. No council, no code, no hierarchy. Just a man, immensely powerful and immensely compromised, trying to fight an empire that his existence helped consolidate, trying to protect a family whose safety his survival endangered, trying to believe that a choice he made in one terrible moment was sufficient to counterbalance everything that came before it. Whether it would have been sufficient, that's the question the alternate timeline never answers cleanly, because there is a version of this story where Anakin's survival accelerates the rebellion enough to prevent 2 decades of Imperial atrocity, and where the galaxy reaches something resembling justice faster and at lower cost than the actual timeline allowed. That version exists as a genuine possibility, and there is a version where the accelerated conflict, the compressed timeline, the Empire's specific brutality toward Anakin's network and Anakin's family costs more lives in 15 years than the actual Empire cost in 20, a grimmer calculus, but a real one.
The Force, if you are inclined to think in those terms, does not obviously prefer one version.
The balance it is always described as seeking is not the same thing as the absence of suffering. It is hard not to notice, looking at the shape of both timelines, that the path through the darkness was in neither case painless, that the galaxy's reckoning with what the Republic had allowed itself to become was always going to be paid for in specific, irreversible human costs, regardless of which choice was made at the hinge point of Order 66, which raises a darker possibility than most people are comfortable sitting with. What if the choice at Order 66 was never actually the hinge point? What if the hinge point was earlier? What if it was the night the Council sent a 9-year-old boy away because they were afraid of him? What if it was the mission where Obi-Wan chose duty over the conversation that might have changed everything? What if it was the 10,000 small moments in which an institution that claimed to understand the Force failed to understand the person standing directly in front of it? If that's true, if the real failures were distributed across decades and dozens of people and one flawed and ancient organization, then the question of whether Anakin refused Order 66 is almost secondary. It changes the shape of the tragedy. It does not change the fact of it. And if that's what happened, if the galaxy was always going to pay for what had been accumulating long before Palpatine transmitted a single order to a single army, then the alternate timeline is not a story about a choice that saved everything. It is a story about a choice that changed which everything paid the price. The title asks a simple question: what if Anakin refused? And the answer, traced honestly, is this: he would have survived. The galaxy would not have been saved. The darkness would have found a different shape, moved at a different speed, and cost different people in different ways. Palpatine would have adapted, because Palpatine had always planned for contingencies. The rebellion would have risen faster and burned hotter and bled more people in less time. And Anakin Skywalker, the man who finally chose correctly at the worst possible moment, surrounded by the consequences of every choice he had made before, it would have spent the rest of his life trying to determine whether a single refusal was enough to define a man. The haunting implication is not that he would have failed, it is that we cannot be certain he would have been right to think it mattered as much as he needed it to matter. That the galaxy's capacity for darkness was never really inside him. It was distributed through every institution, every political calculation, every fear and ambition that had been building for a generation before he was ever born. That he was not the cause of the darkness. He was only the moment when the darkness became undeniable. And if that's true, then the real question the title has always been asking isn't what happens if Anakin refuses. It's why we needed one man's refusal to matter so much in the first place, and what we were refusing to look at while we were watching him. If what you've always accepted as the galaxy's turning point turns out to have had deeper foundations than a single choice, what else have we mistaken for a moment that was actually a decade in the making? If you want more Star Wars truths that are rarely examined, you know where to find them. Subscribe if this made you see it differently. And leave a comment with one answer. If you were Anakin in that moment, with everything he knew and everything he feared, what would you have actually done?